I'm an astronaut on the International Space Station and I'm going to perish here in the vast coldness of space, looking down at the destroyed planet I no longer recognize, that I used to call home. Sometimes I can't even comprehend the things I've seen, it's like they all string together into one long horrifying nightmare. I'm writing this in case somebody somehow might find it and know what happened. I don't think anyone's left alive to read it. Maybe some alien race will happen by and see this floating hulk of a derelict planet and wonder what happened. In any case, I might as well get started and hope to finish before I run out of food and air. I'd been on the station for 96 days. My name is Noah, and like the famous Bible character, I also watched as the planet was ravaged by disaster. Where his was a flood, mine was many magnitudes worse. Things started getting out of hand back on day 89 of my tour. It all began very innocently. We were preparing to watch and monitor the solar eclipse that would cross North America. Judy, Sven, and I brought our laptops to our favorite porthole and watched as the blue spinning ball we call Earth sat beautifully before us, as if waiting for the show to begin. George and Sergey were busy with another project, but promised they would take a break to watch when the eclipse was in full bloom. We camped out and waited until the moon moved into position and cast a shadow on the Earth. It was amazing, like someone had painted a blurry black spot on top of the clouds. The first place to go dark was Texas. It began its path, working its way from the south-central United States to the northeast. I lived in Pennsylvania with my wife and 4-year-old son. I sent them an email reminding them to get ready. They sent back pictures with their cardboard sunglasses on. I took a few pictures, but most of them were when the sun blacked out Pennsylvania, or at least the northwestern tip of it. We lived in the middle, but there was still enough eclipse for them to see. My boy was excited. I'm not sure he knew about what, but my wife and I had hyped it up enough that he really wanted to see the me-clipse, as he called it. After the shadow had passed, they sent me pictures that looked like an orange crescent moon. My wife had held the glasses over the lens of the camera and taken a picture of the eclipse. We were all very excited, taking pictures and sending them back and forth to family, taking pictures and sending them back and forth to family. So excited that we nearly missed what had happened next. Once the moon had moved away from the sun, someone noticed that there was still a shadow on the sun. We immediately scanned it with our glasses and sure enough, it looked like there was a hole in the sun. We scanned it and discovered it was the largest coronal ejection ever recorded. I've gotta go, honey. Astronaut stuff. I sent in an email. I didn't have time to wait for a reply. Houston, we have a potential problem, Judy said. What problem is that? Royce said from his desk inside Mission Control. What problem is that? Roy said from his desk inside Mission Control, sounding like he wasn't quite awake. The sun seems to be spitting out chunks of radiation. There was a silence on the line. When Roy came back on, he didn't sound asleep anymore. ISS, we are initiating an emergency maneuver, he said. Stow everything that isn't tied down and get to the emergency. Sue is capsule right now. What maneuver are you doing? I said as the others floated past me, heading to stow everything. We're going to accelerate you toward the dark side ASAP, Roy said. Hopefully it will act as a shield and protect you from damage. What about our onboard shields? Won't they be enough? We're not willing to chance it. The thing looks massive. Roger, Houston. Better safe than sorry. With that, I gathered up anything the others had and then headed for the emergency capsule. The next few minutes were a mad scramble to get things shut down, protected, whatever we could. Once I was in the capsule with the others, I told them about the plan to use the Earth as a shield. Roy maneuvered us as best as he could to the dark side of the planet, knowing the blast of radiation was on its way and nothing would stop it. It seemed strange, thinking that our survival depended on someone hundreds of miles away, piloting our station by remote. All of us were strapped in, Just worried about staying alive and didn't think about the planet that we were using to protect us and how it and its inhabitants would be affected. As nerve-wracking as it was, running around trying to get everything done, it was 10 times worse sitting strapped into chairs watching a timer count down as the shadow of the Earth inched ever closer. The last moments were the most harrowing. We witnessed our own eclipse as the sun slowly disappeared behind the shadow of the Earth at the same time that the timer went to zero. For one pregnant moment, nothing happened. We looked at each other, thinking maybe they had done it and we were in the clear. But that's when the red lights flashed and the alarms blared as the ship began to shudder. "Houston, we're experiencing severe turbulence," Judy said. "Do we need to jettison the escape module?" Static answered back as the shaking intensified. "Houston, please respond. Do we eject the escape module?" "Shouldn't they be the ones to do that?" Sven said. "If we've lost contact, they might not be able to do it remotely," she said. Her hand hovered over the button that would end everybody's missions and send us back to Earth as failures. Once the escape pod was ejected, that was it. Everybody's mission was over and the computer automatically set a predetermined course for our rendezvous spot on Earth. "Houston, come in please," she said, the desperation creeping into her voice as her hand moved a millimeter closer to the eject button. I couldn't speak for anyone else, but I was feeling like a milkshake from the vibration. If it was this bad attached to a space station roughly the size of a football field, how much worse would it be if we launched the Escape, a space station roughly the size of a football field? How much worse would it be if we launched the Escape module that was roughly the size of a school bus? I watched the same calculations run through her mind, but there was nothing else. Either wait it out or eject before catastrophic failure. "In space, nobody can hear you hesitate, Commander. We must do something," Sergei said. The vibrations had gotten so loud I wasn't sure if she had heard him. Apparently he thought the same thing. "Commander," he said again. "Houston," she said, ignoring him. "We were about to eject the escape module. If you can hear us, please respond with instructions, affirmative or negative." The moments of radio silence were the longest of our lives. Her finger touched the surface of the button, not yet pressing. Once suddenly, the vibrations became less violent. I looked out of the porthole and the Earth was completely enveloped in black. "We made it," I said with a sigh of relief. "We are in Earth's shadow." She looked at me with hollow eyes and then out the porthole. Her hand came away from the button and she replaced the protective cover over it and then glared at Sergei. The vibration slowed and finally stopped. The entire crew breathed a collective sigh of relief. "Houston," Judy said. "We are in Earth's shadow. Radiation averted. Please advise." "What's to advise?" Sven said. "Isn't the emergency over?" "We should wait to see if the danger has passed," she said. "I'm not waiting," Sergei said. "Isn't the emergency over?" "We should wait to see if the danger has passed," she said. "I'm not waiting," Sergei said, unbuckling his seatbelt and drifting toward the hatch. "Me neither," Sven said, following him. Judy watched them go, eyes full of anger and helplessness. She looked from the hatch to me. I sat patiently waiting for orders, as did George. Conflicting emotions flashed across her face. "I guess we'd better get up there before they commandeer all the good grub," she said with a wan smile. George and I unbuckled and followed her through the hatch toward the main command module. All the way, there were signs of the incident. Things were strewn about and floating in the path that hadn't been properly stowed, but there didn't seem to be much real damage. When we got to the command module, Sergei and Sven were already there powering up computers and doing checks. "I would like a full check down of all areas," she said, with a special focus on any air leaks. Each of us looked from one to the other. "Sergei and Sven," she said, "please take the aft modules. Noah and George, check the other ships to make sure they're fully secured. And what will you do? Sergei said. I'll continue trying to contact Houston, she said. Sergei looked at Sven and started to turn toward Judy when Sven grabbed him and dragged him away toward the aft section. George and I checked the other ships and found them firmly in place. We had been lucky, and I think we all knew it. I think deep down we also knew we wouldn't have survived ejecting no matter what Sergei might say on the way back. I happened to glance out a portal at Earth and noticed something odd back at the command module. I asked the commander if she had had any luck contacting Houston. No, she said. It's strange, it's almost like they're not there. They aren't, I said. What do you mean? Look, I said, pointing toward the porthole. She drifted closer and stared out. Okay, I give up. What am I supposed to be looking at? She said. Doesn't Earth look a lot darker than it usually does? I said. She looked again. Oh no, she said as it dawned on her what was wrong. What is it? Sergei said, coming into the room. No lights, she whispered to herself. Everybody looked out as realization washed across their faces. Everybody looked out as realization washed across their faces. The solar flare, Sven said, must have wiped out all the power in the computers and electronics. I said, what about backups? George said, even backups aren't computerized anymore. I said. Judy's face went ashen. Check our position, I said. Judy's face went ashen. Check our position, she said. I started typing on the computer only to find an answer I didn't want. Our orbit is decaying, I said. They must have lost control as we were starting down, trying to get away from the flare. We need to gain some altitude quick, she said, taking the controls. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she brought the thrusters online. The vibrations increased as the pressure of a football field-sized space station was slowly brought back on course. We looked at the walls around us, wondering if they could handle the stress, or if we were all about to die a horrible death as the structure failed and we were sucked out into the void of space. Carefully, she brought the nose of the station up, bringing us into a higher orbit close to our original altitude. We all breathed a sigh of relief as the sun rose when the station came out of the shadow of the Earth and we felt the vibrations return. They weren't nearly as strong as before, which told me the solar flare was almost over. Can we bring the station around and go back behind the Earth? George said. Judy thought for a moment. The stress would be too much pressure on the hull. We would snap like a pretzel, she said. But the solar flare, it seems to be dying down, she interrupted. I think we'll be fine if we go back to our normal orbit. George opened his mouth to say something and then closed it and remained silent. I think our next order of business is to find out what happened on the planet, she said. Start emailing anybody and everybody you know. Hopefully we can get some answers. Everybody went their separate ways to their own quarters to start emailing. A few hours later, it was my time to sleep. I went to bed having not gotten a single response. I stared at the last email that I had gotten from my wife. Her last words were, "I'll talk to you later." I hoped they'd be true. Day 90. Every day that I wake up in space, it's confusing. We don't have beds like you would think of them. In zero gravity, you climb into a sleeping bag and wear it like a vest inside what basically looks like a padded coffin. Imagine waking up in that every day. I woke expecting a slew of emails wanting to know what was wrong. Instead, I found none. Most of them came back as undeliverable. That didn't make sense to me right away. Changing into my uniform, I went to the bathroom, another interesting thing in space, and then I floated to the command module. It didn't surprise me to find the commander already there working on the computer. Any luck? I said as I drifted up beside her. If you count bad luck, I've had lots. She sat without looking at me. I smiled. How about good luck? I said. None. Did any of your emails come back as undeliverable? All of them. Why's that? She turned and looked at me. You really don't know. I shook my head. The servers are on Earth. If there's no power for the servers, they can't do their job. So no emails get delivered. I thought they had battery backups. Oh, for an hour or two, maybe 4 or 5 at the most. But when you're dealing with warehouses full of servers, there just aren't enough batteries to go around. Besides, I think this solar flare might have been strong enough to fry the electronics. Well, then what about us? Why did our electronics survive? Because we're shielded for such a thing. Why did our electronics survive? Because we're shielded for such a thing, and we hid behind the planet. Earth took the brunt of the blow and we only got the after effects. So, if we would have been hit straight on, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. What conversation? Sergey said, drifting into the room. Judy whipped around and looked at him. We were talking about the solar flare and how we're lucky to have lived through it. Yeah, right, Sergey said. Solar flares happened all the time when Sergey was on station the first time. Not a big concern. What could be a big concern until we regain control with Houston is a collision avoidance. She said they had computers running 24/7 watching for anything that might damage us. They would steer around things that we wouldn't even see. So you want Sergey to go watch for rocks so you can get him out the way. No, I want Sergey to go watch for rocks so I can get us out of the way. He glared at her for a long moment and then smiled. Sergey will take care of it, he said, and then drifted off. She turned back to the computer. What do you think that meant? I said. I think it meant that he'll take care of it, she said without taking her eyes off the screen. I took the hint and laughed. 90 minutes, that's how long it takes us to do a full orbit around the Earth. For those of you who don't want to do the math, that means that we're moving at 17,227 miles per hour, the ultimate thrill ride. It also means that we can see the dark side and light side of the Earth every hour and a half. Every time I passed a porthole, I glanced toward the dark side, looking for and hoping to find some lights. It would mean this power thing was just temporary and soon things would be back to normal. But every time I looked, I was disappointed. And soon things would be back to normal. But every time I looked, I was disappointed. It was difficult not to imagine my wife and son sitting in the dark, wondering what was going on. Wondering if I'm alright the same way I'm thinking about them. I could see my wife sitting in bed with my son, a flashlight in hand, reading him a story and telling him that everything's going to be okay. I just wish that it would have been okay. I wish that I hadn't come on this mission. Had I known what was going to happen, I would have stayed home to be with my family. We could have spent our last few fleeting moments together. Even when the worst happened, I could have been there to comfort them, to tell them that everything's going to be alright, even if I know that it's a lie. I heard a bang and looked out the porthole to see one of these solar collectors had been hit by a piece of space debris. Fortunately, the damage was not critical. We lost a solar collector, but there were plenty more where that came from. It was lucky that it hit there, not one of the modules. Going 17,000 miles per hour means anything that we hit was going to have a lot of impact. After that hit, the commander had 3 of us watching for debris. We switched out in shifts with whoever was at the controls and the alternate that gave rest and bathroom breaks. When I was on watch, I had lots of time to focus on how miserable I was without my family and how much I would give for just one message from them. Day 91. Constantly watching for tiny pieces of space junk as small as a football can not only make your eyes go buggy, it can wear on your mind too. You start thinking that you see things that aren't there. You see space junk everywhere. Multiply that by 3 for all the spotters and you can imagine the pilot going crazy, getting constant spottings and having to maneuver around things that aren't there. Suffice it to say, everybody was on edge to say the least. We still kept trying to contact anyone on the surface, be it by radio or email. Heck, I would have volunteered to spacewalk out on the solar panels to build a fire and send smoke signals if I thought it would have helped. But everybody on Earth was silent. At least from space, I couldn't imagine the amount of noting and lawlessness going on right now. I tried to block it out of my head after the first time I imagined someone breaking into my house and doing terrible things to my family. I was so lost in thought that I almost didn't notice a satellite port side, hard to starboard. I held on as the station listed to the starboard. Crossing my fingers mentally, I watched in horror as the satellite hit one of the modules and tore through it. Red lights flashed and alarms sounded as I heard a terrible metal ripping sound. 20 feet away, a tear in the metal grew larger by the second. Air blew out into space, helping the tear grow bigger. It wouldn't be long until the entire module was exposed to space. Out of nowhere, Sergei appeared on the far side of the rep. He struggled to make it toward me, clinging onto the handholds and pulling with all that he had. I tried to make it to him, but before I could, he closed off the hatch and sealed it, saving the module and the rest of the station. The problem was he was on the other side. Both of us together could have pulled it close, but he wasn't able to get back inside before the module would have been torn apart. I floated up to the door and looked out, pounding on it and screaming at him to come back inside. He responded with a slow salute before his lifeless body drifted off into space. Tears floated in my eyes, making it hard to see. I had to wipe them away before I could go to the command module. What happened? Judy said as soon as I drifted into the room. There was a collision, but Sergei took care of it, I said quietly. She turned from the computer and looked into my tear-filled eyes. How? He was at the far end when the satellite hit, I said. It tore through the module and it would have destroyed the station if he hadn't sealed the door. He was on the other side, wasn't he? She said with a vacant look in her eyes. I nodded. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. No one should have to see that, she said. Why don't you go take a break? I wiped my tears. How am I supposed to do that when we're down a man and we still need spotters? I need spotters who aren't distracted by grief, she said. Go take a break. I went to my quarters and before I knew it, I was fast asleep. Day 92. You've heard of sleepwalking. Well, imagine drifting aimlessly in your sleep, floating out of your bedroom down the stairs into the kitchen, bumping into a wall and harmlessly bouncing off it, only to be grabbed and dragged back to reality. Noah, George said, holding my shoulders as I opened my eyes. What are you doing in my room? I said, still half asleep. I'm not, he said. You must have forgotten to strap yourself in and drifted into the command module. I looked around and sure enough I was surrounded by computers. Oh, sorry about that, I said. I'll get dressed and get back on scout duty. See if you can get Sven to get some sleep. He said. He's refused to come off watch duty ever since Sergei. I'll see what I can do. I said. Feeling the awkward silence. I changed and went back to relieve Sven. No, I'll stay. He said. Refusing to even look away from the porthole. And what happens when you fall asleep looking out there? That won't happen. You sure about that? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a bottle of pills and then popped one in his mouth and chewed it up. Positive, he said. Those will only last so long, I said, and if you use them too much, you'll start to hallucinate. Imagine how embarrassing it would be if you start calling out objects that aren't there. He glanced at me for a moment. Won't happen. Okay, I'm about to relieve someone. If not you, then I'll relieve George. And once that happens, I won't be available for 8 hours. Can you really hold out for another 8 hours? Nothing to eat, no bathroom break. He glanced at me again and his shoulders slumped. Okay, I'll take a break, he said, but expect me back in an hour. I held up my hands in surrender and watched as he floated towards the main module. He wasn't out of sight before he bumped into a wall because he had fallen asleep. As he floated, I shook my head and began scanning outside looking for any objects that could impact the station. My eyes drifted naturally toward Earth when I saw a flash of orange on the surface followed by a massive cloud. My eyes drifted naturally toward Earth when I saw a flash of orange on the surface, followed by a massive cloud. I tried to determine where the explosion had happened before the cloud obscured it. Commander, I said into the comm, look at the planet. Oh my God, she said barely above a whisper. Do you think one of those idiots pushed the button? I don't know, it looks like it. Did you see where it hit? North America looks like somewhere in the middle. Maybe the plains or the Rockies. That doesn't make sense for a first strike. Why wouldn't they go for New York or DC? I don't know, I only got a glimpse before the cloud covered it. Wait, look at it. She said. It's still shooting smoke into the air. That means it's not a nuke. It's a volcano. Yellowstone, I whispered, knowing that it was much worse than a nuclear bomb. The Yellowstone supervolcano was rumored to be powerful enough to take out entire states. Scientists had been debating for years when it would erupt and how powerful it would be. Looking down at the expanding cloud of ash that already covered a large section of the Midwest, I saw that it was moving east quickly. Like they needed that right now, Judy said. What can we do? I said with desperation creeping into my voice. Nothing. We can't do anything except survive. I watched as the massive cloud of volcanic ash made its way towards the eastern states and prayed that it would somehow disperse before it got to Pennsylvania. If only I could communicate with my wife and let her know how to get out of there. But no one had heard anything from anyone on the planet after the eclipse for years. Doomsayers have called eclipses the harbingers of doom. I guess this time they got it right. I found myself once again wishing that I hadn't come on this trip. Even if I had been in mortal peril on the planet, at least I would be with my family. If we died, we would die together. The station moved out of range and I couldn't see what was left to see of the United States anymore. I focused on watching for debris and counted the minutes until the US was in sight again. Once I could see it, I wished that I couldn't. Was in sight again. Once I could see it, I wished that I couldn't. The ash cloud had spread and was now covering Pennsylvania. It was nearly to the Atlantic coast. Between the volcano continuing to erupt and the winds carrying the ash, the United States was almost totally covered. Nuclear winter had begun, or I suppose it would be called volcanic winter. Only the west coast was spared. Even parts of central and eastern Canada were obscured. I couldn't see the volcano erupting, but the clouds of ash seemed to billow up from it, making me believe that the eruption was still happening. It dawned on me that I was watching millions of people die. Not only were they helpless without power, now they were without sunlight too. Eternal darkness would destroy plants, so there wouldn't be any food growing this year over much of the country, and probably for years to come. Panic and selfishness would have people at each other's throats, fighting over the last scraps of available food. The only hope they would have would be to move west, but then there would be overcrowding and starvation would still run rampant. Noah, Judy said, breaking me out of my depressing thoughts. Yes, Commander, I said, trying to keep the emotions out of my voice. I know it looks bad down there, but there's nothing that we can do to help them. Apparently, she had been having the same thoughts as me. Understood, Commander. We need to focus on our survival until part of the world recovers enough to help us out. Meaning? Meaning right now, we have nothing to go back to, she said. Until somebody gets power on again and can get us a reasonable place to land, we need to take care of ourselves. And what if they don't get power back, I said. The question hung there in the air. We die, George said into the comm. Just like every other human being before us. I rolled my eyes. Thank you, Professor Sunshine, for that happy thought. I said, hey, just keeping it real. George said, I wouldn't want you to go and think you're immortal or anything. We would never be able to fit past your swolled head in the module. I heard a stifled chuckle that sounded like Judy. Okay, well, while we're talking about mortality and the lack of it, perhaps somebody could steer hard to port to avoid some incoming debris. The station lifted to the port side a few seconds later. I chuckled until I saw the debris up close. It was Sergei's body. He passed harmlessly by, his arms outstretched, looking like he was waving. His dead, accusing eyes stared at me. Noah, came the commander's voice over the comm, startling me. Yes? Are we clear? On yes? Are we clear? On what? Are we clear of the debris? Oh, yeah. The debris passed us without doing any physical harm. There was a long pause. Okay, Judy said. You sure you're alright? Yes. Sounds like you need some sleep, George said. I just got up, I said. Oh. Day 93. The rest of yesterday was a blur of boredom and eye strain. There wasn't any more debris even though I dreaded the thought of seeing Sergei's body again. I wondered if it would be a reoccurring thing since we were in orbit. It was possible to see him occasionally. I saw another volcano erupt today. My hope was that yesterday's eruption would be an anomaly that would be recoverable. But with today's eruption in the Pacific, it was looking like things weren't going to get better anytime soon. It was looking like things weren't going to get better anytime soon. There was only a sliver of the west coast visible now. All of the rest of the United States was under a cloud of ash. I thought about my wife and son, hoping they were somehow okay. One glance at the ash cloud covering the US dashed those hopes. I began to realize that I might never see them again. I thought about the last words my wife had said to me. Talk to you later. I wondered if she ever would. I would like to think if she had known those could be her last words to me, she would have said something more meaningful. Stifling a tear, I took over watch for George, who floated off, eyes barely open. We were exhausting ourselves keeping watch for debris, but without Houston to monitor from the ground, there wasn't any choice. If we didn't watch, we couldn't avoid. And if we didn't avoid, one of these times a piece of debris would rip through our hull at 17,000 miles an hour and end our little mission real quick. Part of our duties had been trying to contact anyone on Earth. Emails had gone all unanswered. Houston hadn't responded since the solar flare, and we had been trying to contact any ham radio operators. Nothing had worked though. Every failure made it that much harder to try again. Until... CQ, can anybody hear me? I heard over the radio. At first, I thought that I was dreaming. Anybody out there, come in. It wasn't a dream. I grabbed the microphone. I can hear you, I said over the radio. Really, the voice said. I've been trying for 3 days and you're the only one who's answered. Commander, I said over the comm, I have somebody on ham radio. And then I read her the frequency and she tuned into it. Hello, can you hear me, she said. Oh, there's somebody else listening in, he said, and a woman to boot. What's your name there, little lady? Judy Moden, she said. I'm the commander of the ISS space station, he said back slowly. So you're flying around up there in the stars? Yes sir, she said, but we're curious about what's happened on Earth over the last few days. Well, ain't you seen it, he said. Yeah, but the ash cloud keeps us from observing what's happening on the surface. What's happening on the surface is awful, he said matter-of-factly. I live in Washington State just outside of Seattle, and even though we ain't under the cloud, there's still all kinds of stuff going on and ain't none of it good. Can you tell us what happened from your point of view, I said. He sighed. That eclipse is what happened. People had been saying bad things was gonna happen because of it, and they were surely right. What happened after the eclipse? Julie said. Well, that's when all the lights went out. I'm not just talking about a blackout. Everything with electronics in it just went kaput. Radios, them newfangled LED flashlights, cars, not only those stupid electric, but all cars just like that. Dead in the water. The solar storm, I said. What was that? He said. There was a solar storm. Probably the biggest one ever. It hit right after the eclipse. We barely managed to escape it. And this solar storm, it would knock out electronics. Yeah, definitely. We've been waiting for the power to go back on so that we could contact someone. Well, I can tell you that ain't happening anytime soon. Why not? Judy said. Because ain't nobody trying to fix them. After that storm thing you said about people went nuts, it was like somebody beamed the crazy right into him. Everybody was running around in the dark stealing everything they could. They didn't even stop to think if it was usable. I saw punk teenagers running around with TVs on their shoulders. There ain't no power, why would you even steal a TV? What about the police? Where are they? Half of them quit on the spot to protect their families. The rest were overwhelmed, ambushed, taken out by people. At least that's what happened here. I can't imagine it went much different in other cities. It weren't a day or two later that blasted volcano blew its stack, as if it wasn't rough enough without electricity. How do you have power to run your radio? If you don't mind me asking, Judy said. A backup generator. I've got enough gas to run it and a few other things for a while, but after that, it's gonna get a bit dicey. I thought you said that all electronics were destroyed. Yeah, but not everything was always made with electronics now, was it? My radio here is solid state, runs on tubes. Thank God I've got an old beater truck that has points instead of electronic ignition. Old stuff isn't always bad, as sometimes it's just old. I smiled, he had a point. Can you tell us anything else that's been going on? Judy sighed. I could picture the man rubbing his chin with thought. Well, ever since that volcano went up, we've been getting lots of quakes. I mean, like, a lot. At least a dozen a day, and some of them are downright whoppers. I live out in the woods, but I've gone out and cut down any trees that were close enough to my house that might fancy to fall that way if a quake got bad enough. That's smart. Sounds like you're pretty well prepared. Son, ain't no one prepared for this. I just hope these quakes settle down and no more volcanoes blow. One already has. Where? He said quickly. Out in the Pacific. Dang it, the Ring of Fire. Ring of Fire, Judy said. Yeah, there are these volcanoes from the west coast all the way over to Asia. They form a loose circle, the Ring of Fire. If they start popping off, I don't know. Well, here's hoping they don't, I said. Hope is an empty cup of coffee, son. It ain't gonna fill itself. I could hear static getting stronger. I think we're going out of range. I hope, maybe, we'll be able to talk to you again on the next pass. Maybe. Good luck to ya. You too, and oh, I forgot, what's your name? I'm Simon. What's yours? Noah. He chuckled. Well, good luck on that arc of yours. I'll be hearing from you. I could barely hear his last words through the static and then he was gone. For a moment, I was alone with my thoughts. I could barely hear his last words through the static and then he was gone. For a moment, I was alone with my thoughts. Commander? Yes? What did you make of all that? I heard her sigh. If the solar flare really did fry all the electronics like you said, Houston won't be able to help us. I'm sure they're trying to get themselves going again, but without power or electronics. I don't see what they'll be able to do. And they're under the ash cloud too. I said, they might be in survival mode like everybody else. Too busy to worry about us. Unfortunately, that's what I'm thinking too. Then why don't we just aim this thing at the planet and take a nosedive? Sven said it sounds like you two have already decided it's hopeless, we never know what tomorrow will bring. Sven. Judy said we have to hang on and see. Oh yeah, you should tell Sergey that. Sven said under his breath. Hey, that was uncalled for. Sergey made a choice, save himself or save the rest of us. And now here we are alone, abandoned, waiting to die, Sven said. It sounds like you're the one who feels hopeless. It sounds to me like both of you need to drop it and get back to watching, she said. Her words were cut off when the station lifted to the side with these sounds of groaning metal. I dove toward the nearest porthole and searched for what had happened. Impact, starboard side, I said. Looks like damage to some of our solar collectors. What was the debris? She said. I saw what it was, but I didn't want to say at that moment, so I said. Undetermined. I crossed my fingers, hoping she would get the message and drop it. I need you to determine it so we can see how much damage it caused, she said, completely missing the point. I can't say. Why not? I gritted my teeth. Why wasn't she getting it? He doesn't want to say, Sven said over the comm, because the debris is Sergei's dead body. The comm went silent. That moment is when George decided to rise from his nap. Good morning, everyone, he said. Did I miss anything? No one answered back. Hello, he said, tapping his mic. Is this thing on? Shut up, George, Sven said. What did I do? It's best just to drop it, I said. Come relieve me, I need a break. Day 94. Judy had been on the radio with Simon again. He said the quakes were getting worse. She told him another volcano had erupted, this time near South America. He appreciated the information but said that he was powerless to do anything about it. Speaking of power, she said, have you seen anybody else with lights on? Of course not, Simon said. The only time I've seen them would be at night, and no one's stupid enough to turn their lights on at night. It'd be like ringing the dinner bell for predators. And I don't mean just animals. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I said over the radio to Simon, but it looks like there's a cloud of ash that's headed your way from the second volcano. Yeah, I've been watching it. Appreciate the heads up though. I don't know if we'll be able to communicate if it reaches you. Probably not. These radios are designed to bounce off the atmosphere to get more distance. That ash will block you out. I'm almost sure of it. I hope not. What did I tell you about hope? You said, poking fun at me. The static began and I knew that we only had a few more moments. Take care of yourself, I said. You too. Oh wait, I almost forgot, there's something else that's going on. What is it? I said, hearing a blast of static. I thought that I had lost him when suddenly I heard. The sun is rising in the wrong place. What does that mean? Maybe we should take a closer look. I stared out the porthole at the planet, but we had already moved away from North America and the light side of the planet. Porthole at the planet, but we had already moved away from North America and the light side of the planet. I see another volcano erupting, I said sadly. This one looks like it's between Africa and Saudi Arabia. We're up to 4, she said. Has there ever been so many major eruptions so close together? Not since the dinosaurs, I said. Hopefully we don't end up sharing their fate. I said as a joke, but she didn't laugh and neither did I. I need a break, she said. Has anybody seen Sven? He was supposed to relieve me an hour ago. Do you want me to go find him? I said. Yeah, go ahead. George, can you take Noah's spot? Sure thing, Commander. A minute later, George came floating up beside me and took over at my porthole. I knew the commander would watch out for the starboard side porthole in the command module, so I went quickly to look for Sven. His sleeping quarters were just across the module from mine. I floated up to a sleeping unit that still reminded me way too much of a padded coffin and knocked. Hey Sven, you having a sleep-in? I said, but I got no response. Come on Sven, I know you're feeling down in the dumps, but we need you. I knocked on the door as much as you can on padding. Let's go, I said, feeling less than enthused with this game. We all have to do our. I pulled on the door and red liquid floated out covering me. Instinct kicked in and I dove away from it, smacking my head against the wall. Oh son of a. I said, grabbing the back of my head where I had hit the wall. Turning back and trying to recover, I drifted closer to the sleeping unit. Sven was hanging in his sleeping bag, but he wasn't moving. Blobs of red liquid floated all around the sleeping chamber. A few drifted out into the module and floated away. I approached Sven. His eyes were open but unmoving. I waved my hand in front of him, feeling his neck. I found no pulse. The sleeves of his shirt were cut and stained red. There was a small piece of paper attached to his sleeve. I removed it and read it, backing out slowly. I went to find the commander. I told her what had happened and she went to see for herself. But why? She said, find the commander. I told her what had happened and she went to see for herself. But why? She said. The only thing that I found on him was this. I said, handing her a note that said, for Sergei. We both hung our heads. There was nothing to say. After telling George about it, we jettisoned his body into space. It just happened to be the time when Sergei's body had appeared. I asked the commander if she had timed it that way on purpose, but she wouldn't answer. Day 95. Simon had been right in the worst way. The sun was coming up at a different place. We had watched and scanned and came up with the worst answer possible, which is saying something about the recent events. The continent was moving. North America was rotating, the eastern seaboard was heading north while the west went south. We debated keeping the truth from Simon, but in the end decided he deserved to know. Besides, he was the one who had noticed it first, so it wouldn't be much of a surprise to him. The ash cloud had covered most of the Pacific and the rest of the U.S. There was nothing left to see of the U.S. but ash. We watched helplessly as more volcanoes erupted and more continents drifted. Africa was headed for the South Pole and Australia for the equator. All three of us watched, mesmerized as we saw our planet begin to reform itself. There was no going back. There was nothing left to return to. I quietly mourned my family as I stared at the cloud of ash where my home used to be. It suddenly made sense why Sven. Anyway, while we watched, Antarctica began drifting north. As it came closer to warmer waters, huge icebergs miles long broke off and drifted away on their own courses. Some floated harmlessly into open water. Some sent massive waves washing over land as they collided into it. Others simply disappeared as they approached tropic waters and melted, causing water levels to rise worldwide. The continents that we could still see, that weren't under an ash cloud, began shrinking. Water was covering land at an alarming rate. There was a small positive out of the situation though. Some of the volcanoes became covered with water and stopped erupting. We never knew what it was that hit the station, but it must have been big. We started rolling uncontrollably. I managed to brace myself in the command module and Judy wedged herself into a spot to ride it out. Unfortunately, George wasn't so lucky. As these stations spun, objects that weren't secured flew around and gained a little gravity thanks to the spin. That was bad news for George. Objects bouncing around slammed into him. Boxes and laptops and everyday things we took for granted became deadly missiles. We watched helplessly as he was beaten and battered. Neither of us was able to even let go because we would have been thrown around the module the same as George. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the rotation slowed and stopped. We both rushed to George and tried to tend his wounds, but it was too late. He had taken several blows to the head along with other body parts. The damage was too much. Day 96. We had a brief ceremony for George yesterday and sent him out into space. I started to question the wisdom of sending dead crewmates out into space since they would only become debris that could destroy us later on. But at this point, I'm not sure how much I cared. I had been questioning why we were going on for a while now. I often wonder if Sven didn't have the right idea, but such thoughts don't keep me doing my duty, so I bury them and keep on going. Doing my duty, so I bury them and keep on going. We hadn't heard from Simon. I'm not sure that we ever will. The continents that we could see were still changing position. Antarctica was now on the equator in less than half the original size. Australia was almost at the South Pole. And the United States were visible again, but for a bad reason. They had drifted north, so far north that the Great Plains were now at the top of the world. Strangely enough, Europe and Asia hadn't moved much, maybe because they hadn't had as many volcanoes erupt around them. It was difficult to watch the planet that I love, where I used to live, being torn apart like that. Judy was in a semi-catatonic state. When she did talk, she mumbled about commandability and losing her crew. I'm not sure how many of the changes on Earth have even registered with her. As the waters rose, I wondered if there was anybody still alive to notice. Land masses were slowly disappearing. It looked like the planet would be completely underwater soon. In the middle of this destruction, something new caught my eye. Somewhere in Europe, there was a phenomenon. At first, it looked like just a shadow smaller than what the eclipse cast in the clouds mere days ago, when everything was still good with the world and there were 8 billion people to fly over. But with each pass, it seemed to grow. I wondered about this and asked Judy if she knew what it was, but she only glanced out the porthole and said no. I racked my brain for a while and then looked up on the computer what it could be. Without ground-based internet, the computer was limited to only what it had loaded in its memory. Eventually, I was able to find a possible answer though. The scientists at the CERN supercollider had proposed constructing a microscopic singularity. Essentially, they wanted to build a tiny black hole on the planet and study it for a potential power source. As soon as I read the article, I thought of what a dangerous idea that would be. It reminded me of when they were about to test fire the first atomic bomb. The scientists weren't 100% sure that it wouldn't cause a chain reaction and burn off the planet's entire atmosphere at this point. I wondered if that wouldn't cause a chain reaction and burn off the planet's entire atmosphere. At this point, I wondered if that wouldn't have been better, rather than wait 80-something odd years to have the planet tear itself apart and kill everyone. I watched helplessly as the dark spot grew bigger. I knew that it would eventually destroy the planet. But then something miraculous happened. Out of all the death and destruction, there was a positive point. The black hole had grown to the point where it touched the ocean. It began swallowing up the water. A few orbits later, I saw land being uncovered again. The continents were drying up as the water had receded. Hope sprung in me that things might not be a total loss. The water had extinguished the volcanoes, and now the black hole was swallowing up the excess water. Perhaps it would get its fill and diminish. It didn't take long to realize what a fool's hope that had been. The black hole did what it was supposed to do, and it swallowed everything. It had begun swallowing land, which made room for more water to disappear, and soon the oceans had begun to dry up, and yet the hole grew. Eventually, I could see it getting bigger with every orbit. More water and land vanished. I could see these shallow parts of the land where the ocean used to be. There was no doubt about it. Soon there would be no planet left to orbit. I was already pulling at the station when we flew over it. Soon it would drag us in like everything else, all because the sun made a shadow over the Earth. I wondered if some scientist on some far-off planet was looking through a telescope right now, fascinated to watch this new black hole as it formed. I should close this entry and beam it out into space, hoping that some alien race will intercept it and read what happened to the little planet that used to orbit the sun, but was now destroyed by it. My name is Noah, and I'm an astronaut from Earth, former third planet from the sun named Sol. If you read this, know that we humans once existed and thrived on our little planet, until disaster took us all. My only comfort is the thought that someday, perhaps the black hole that is destroying my planet will eventually grow big enough to swallow the sun that indirectly created it. That's what we on Earth would call irony. Diolch am wylio ar fideo.